So I'm a historian, not just a professor. I'm a historian who's passionate about history. And I'm hoping that by the time I'm done with my 18 minutes, all of you will be passionate about history. If I've succeeded, you'll all want to become historians, and you'll all understand why being a historian will allow you to change the world. Because the only way you can change the world is by being a historian. Sorry, all of you in other fields. It's only by being a historian. It's the only way that you can do this. Why is that? Because history is the only laboratory we have for the human experience. You cannot study human beings effectively any other way. It's valuable to study them other ways, but history is the only way you can really do it, because it is history that allows us to take account of and understand the complexity of human behavior. Human beings are not lab rats. You cannot isolate human behavior. You have to look at the complexity, the unpredictability, the stubborn indiscipline of human beings. And those of you who are parents of young children like myself know of what I speak. It is not possible to come up with laws for human behavior. It is not possible to come up with formulas for the human experience. What we can do is understand the patterns of human behavior. What we can do is look at the complexity in the ways human beings relate to one another and use that complexity to understand and anticipate some of the ways in which we think they might behave with one another in the future. And therefore, the reason we study history is not about the past. We study history to anticipate the future. We look back to think forward. We look back to think forward. It's the only way you can think forward. And I want us to do that today as we look at our society today. We need to look back to think forward today. We are not looking back, and therefore we are not thinking forward. And I mean that very seriously about all of us in this room. Our last presidential election was an ahistorical election, and we did not think seriously about who we are as a society, about what it is that has made us a great society, and about what it is we can take from our past greatness to make ourselves even greater in the future. Let me put that even more critically, if I might. We face huge challenges today. We have faced huge challenges in the past. The difference is, today, we are not addressing those challenges. We have not even begun. We don't even know where to start. My students come into my classes, and they know the problems, or they know a little bit about the problems. They don't think they can do anything about it. We don't think we can do anything about it. And shame on us. That is ahistorical thinking. That is looking for a silver bullet. That is not acceptable. If we are all historians, we will look back and realize, as we look back today, that we can find means of empowering ourselves and empowering our institutions and empowering our society to deal with the problems that we face today. And that's what I want to talk about. My argument is that if we look back, we can see that people in prior periods, particularly earlier in this last 20th century, citizens and leaders made choices that we are not making today. They took action that we are not taking today. They did things that we are not doing today. Now, we look back to what they did, not because it's a formula for what we should do today. History does not repeat itself. We look back to take inspiration, to take some solace, to get some energy for making similar kinds of choices in new ways today. So we will not repeat the past, but we must use the past to empower us to think creatively today. That is overall why you all should be historians. If you want to imagine, you must look back. Look at the roads we have taken, look at the roads we have not taken, and think about the roads we can build based upon the roads we have been on and not been on in the past. We are designing a new future for ourselves, and it must be built on the history that we have lived with in the past. So there are three ways I want us to think about this. Three kinds of historical choices that Republicans and Democrats, socialists and conservatives, non-political entities did in the past. Three kinds of choices that we need to embrace today. They are choices to dream, choices to connect, and choices to improve. And when I'm done, please ask yourself, are we choosing to dream today? How can we choose to dream more? Are we choosing to connect today? How can we choose to connect more? Are we choosing to improve ourselves today? How can we choose to improve ourselves some more? And how can the history of how we have done this in prior periods give us some ideas about how we can do it in new ways? Not in replaying the old ways, but in new ways today. So let's begin with dreaming. This is the worst part of our society today. We are a society filled with spectacle, but no dreams. Flash, but no vision. Information, but no ideas. We're not thinking about how our society could be different. And I want to tell you that what's most extraordinary as a historian is to look back and see how in other periods people had such more dynamic imaginations. How much more dynamic and rich their imaginations were than ours today. We've got the gadgets, they had the imaginations. I want to transport you back briefly to the world of the 1930s in our society. A world when most people still did not have telephones. And they had no idea what a television was because it did not exist. Most people could not communicate, even with their neighbors in the way we can communicate with people around the world today. But what's extraordinary about that time, what's extraordinary about this society in the 1930s, is how citizens imagined a world, despite their deprivation, that they had never seen, but had faith they could create. There was a man named Lyndon Johnson who grew up in the hill country outside of Austin, Texas, grew up with no electricity in his rural area, grew up with no jobs in the Depression, worked on a road crew, but imagined, you can see this in his diary, and he was not alone, imagined a world of electricity and light in rural areas. One of the biggest projects Americans undertook during one of the worst economic periods in our society was to bring electricity to rural areas so, in Lyndon Johnson's terms, the lights could be turned on. No one had ever seen that before. There had not been rural electrification in our society, anywhere near that scale. From the 1930s to the 1960s, Americans imagined it, and they built it. They would not have just built it if they had not imagined it. Another example that I want to share with you, an even more important example, perhaps, is the imagination of the American president at that time. Franklin Roosevelt is remembered and revered for many things. But remember what I say now. He was, above all, a dreamer-in-chief before he was a commander-in-chief. He inherited the worst economic situation the United States has faced in about a century. He inherited a society with more than 12% unemployment, a society where there was no social safety net. And he did not know what to do. But he believed that he could paint a picture of a new society and motivate Americans to live to it. And he believed, ladies and gentlemen, that he could paint a picture of a new world. In August of 1941, this disabled president got on a boat and went off the coast of the northeast of Canada to Newfoundland and met with another man you might have heard of called Winston Churchill. They met on another boat, and Winston Churchill asked Franklin Roosevelt for help in defending his society against the ravages of German missiles, against the ravages of German airplanes, against the ravages of the German war machine. And the same things were happening in Asia at that time. Franklin Roosevelt said to Winston Churchill, "I can only help you if you will not put Band-Aids on the old world, but instead help me build a new one." This is when the United States is still in depression itself, still in a slow economy. But yet Roosevelt is willing to imagine a new world. He forces Winston Churchill in 2 days to sign a 2-page document. And small documents often mean more than large documents. A small 2-page document called the Atlantic Charter. The Atlantic Charter lays out 3 principles. The end of empire in a world filled with empires. The opening of free trade in a world without free trade. And what are known soon as human rights. The Atlantic Charter talks of an institution that does not exist yet, called the United Nations. It speaks of creating international law, and it speaks of a system of cooperation between societies that will be more important than just the pursuit of their national interests. Franklin Roosevelt imagined what we would at the time have said was a radically different world, an idealistic world, and he made it happen. He didn't make it happen alone, but without that imagining, there would not have been any kind of blueprint to think about a new world after World War II. Think of the world that comes into existence. Think of what it looks like. It's not nearly filled with all the idealism we'd like to see, but it's far different from what's there before. We built a new world after World War II, not because it was natural, but because people living in terrible war and depression conditions were willing to imagine a different kind of place. They were willing to imagine that they could live differently. They were not willing to accept the world as it is. We should not accept the world as it is. We need to dream. Those citizens chose to dream. They also chose to connect. And here I want to tell a story about a different individual you might have heard of. I've talked of Franklin Roosevelt. Now I need to speak of Ronald Reagan. I will cover all elements of the political spectrum. This is what professors have to do nowadays. But it's a very instructive story. It's a story Ronald Reagan told himself. Ronald Reagan was the second greatest storyteller we've ever had in the White House after Abraham Lincoln. And he, in many ways, gained political leverage, gained political popularity because he told stories that resonated with people. The most compelling Reagan story is the story of his own family. His father, Jack Reagan, was of Irish descent and had a tendency to drink a little, as some are wont to do. But he was a reasonably prosperous shoe salesman in Dixon, Illinois. Rural part of Illinois, small town, rural area of Illinois. That's where young Ronnie Reagan grew up. Well, when the Depression hit, after 1929, and particularly after 1931, when American unemployment really skyrocketed, Jack Reagan could not find people to buy his shoes. So Jack Reagan lost his job. Not for any fault of his own. He wasn't doing anything worse than before. But there was no money to buy shoes, so people went without new shoes. Jack Reagan could not make a living. And what happened with Jack Reagan is what happened with tens of thousands of Americans, especially American males. They went into a tailspin. Jack Reagan began drinking heavily. He began having trouble with Ronnie Reagan's mother. And in fact, Ronald Reagan would recount how the most horrific memory of his life was opening the door one day to their house as a young boy and seeing his father face planted in front of the door, coming home too drunk to get into the house. What saved Reagan's family was the New Deal. Reagan said that himself. It was the New Deal that saved his family. And Reagan began his political career with Franklin Roosevelt as his model. What was it about the New Deal that saved Reagan's family? Well, we know as historians the New Deal didn't create enough jobs. We know as historians the New Deal did not get the economy moving. It is true. Government handouts alone cannot jumpstart an economy. You need business innovation, and the New Deal did not provide enough of that. But what the New Deal did do was it provided an anchor for people to connect to their communities. Jack Reagan got a job through the Federal Relief Agency, created by Franklin Roosevelt, part of a list of many agencies created to put people to work doing things for their community. And you know what Jack Reagan's job was? Community organizer. He was a community organizer for his area. He was responsible because he was a good talker, and since he had been a shoe salesman, he had gone door to door. He knew people. He was responsible for taking the little bits of federal money that came in through the Federal Relief Agency and later the Civilian Works Administration and putting that money into community projects to build roads, to build bridges, to build schools. And many of you know, in your communities, the schools your children go to were built during this period. The roads that you travel on, the non-interstate highways were built during this period. The paths that we go on in national parks were built by the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, during this period. Jack Reagan was responsible for bringing people together. And Ronnie Reagan would say his career was based on the model of that, bringing people together and investing in bringing people together. For all the things that are said about Ronald Reagan, there was one thing he did when he was president. He always talked of America as a single community with people brought together around faith and optimism in their society and making their society better. And even as a Republican president, Ronald Reagan invested in that. Community does not just come naturally. Community is not organic. Community has to be built. It has to be invested in. And innovation needs community. It is extraordinary that we can talk about innovation without talking about community in our society. No one invents anything alone. Everyone needs a community when they invent. It takes a village not just to raise a child, but to make an invention. It takes a village to change the world. The people of Jack Reagan and Ron Reagan's generation invested in building community. Have we invested in building community? We must ask ourselves. The third thing they chose to do, the third thing that changed the United States was they enveloped, they promoted, they imbibed, that generation did, an ethic of self-improvement. And this is the most astounding element of that generation and the most misunderstood. It's often said that this was the greatest generation that went off to war, and they did such extraordinary things. They came back so much better. That's nonsense. War does not make anyone better. There is not a single society that you can study and say, well, because they went to war, people got better because of the war. That's nonsense. They were a generation that accomplished a lot because of what they had done before they went to war. They built on the communities that they had constructed, and they developed, Americans of that generation, an ethic of self-improvement. It would have seemed silly to them to ever be satisfied with your position in life. It would have seemed silly to them that people could make the kinds of salaries that some people make in our society today. It would be silly to them that people would argue against paying taxes for things that are of value in their society. They were not in favor of government waste either, and they were not in favor of entitlements. That would also seem silly to them. They believed that you must constantly improve yourself. How do we know this? Well, that is the only generation that you can find evidence of. Living through a depression, going to war, coming home, and then saying, we will consume less, we will pay more taxes, and we will invest even more in our society after we have done all this. That generation did not come home and say, we've won, we have everything figured out, just leave us alone. They came home and said, we will invest more after living through a depression and living through a war. The single most extraordinary piece of legislation passed in the 20th century is the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, the GI Bill, as it's known, right? What does that do? It increases taxation, it increases government investment, it reduces consumption so that servicemen and women can get federal aid, which they never could get before, to go to university. An entire class of middle-class citizens will get to go to university who never could before. 8 million of them. 8 million of them. And 2 million people will get subsidized loans, not for mansions, they were capped, but for small family dwellings that they could own. It created what historians will now refer to as a stakeholder society. And remember, these were the same families that had sacrificed in the Depression and that had lost loved ones in war. They did not come home and say, we want a peace dividend. They came home and said, we need to keep investing. They did not say, we've figured it all out, we've won. They came home and said, we still have more work to do. Now, I want us to look at our society today and not do what this generation did before. There were many problems with that generation. Their racial attitudes were not as progressive as we'd want them to be. Their attitudes towards gender and sex were not the same as we'd like them to be today. But I want us to look to this generation, to look to this history, to draw inspiration for today. Because the changes the United States went through in mid-20th century were not foreordained. They were not dictated by technology or power. They were made by the choices of the people at the time. They chose to dream, despite the difficulties. They chose to connect, despite the fragmentation of alcohol and depression, and they chose to improve themselves, not to sit on their wealth and buy second and third homes. Let's ask ourselves today if we are making those choices. Beyond that, let's ask ourselves if we are modeling those choices as well. What was stunning about a Franklin Roosevelt that's so different from our politics today is that Franklin Roosevelt spoke honestly to the American people about these issues. He spoke honestly about the problems. He never promised simple solutions. The same was true for Dwight Eisenhower. The same was true for many leaders of that time. And citizens demanded that kind of rhetoric. It's time we demand that our leaders dream. It's time we demand that we all connect. And it's time that we adopt an ethic of self-improvement. And I'm optimistic because I'll tell you, the young people I see in my classrooms, they're better than their parents. They're going to do this. And the sooner we can get them empowered to do this, the better we'll all be. Thank you very much.